Some men walk toward death because they have nothing left to lose. But Hawaiian Blue Hawk walked toward a line of raised rifles because he had finally found something worth dying for. The Dakota Territory stretched vast and unforgiving in the autumn of 1876, a land where the wind carried secrets and the earth held too many graves. Hawaiian Blue Hawk had made his home in the shadow of the Black Hills, far from the reservations where his people were being forced to live like ghosts of themselves. He was 46 years old, lean and weathered, with silver threading through his long black hair and eyes that had seen too much of what men do to each other when fear and greed take hold. For 8 years, he had lived alone in a small cabin built into the hillside, hidden among ponderosa pines and red cedar. He hunted elk and deer, trapped beaver and marten, and spoke to no one except the land itself. The silence had become his companion, his protection, his penance for sins he could not wash away no matter how many years passed. That morning, he was checking his trapline along Rapid Creek when he found something that did not belong. A piece of torn fabric, pale blue calico, caught on a thorn bush. Fresh blood stained the cloth, still wet enough to glisten in the early light. Hawaiian crouched low, studying the ground with the practiced eye of a man who had tracked both animals and men across 100 miles of prairie. The tracks told a story. Small boots, a woman's stride, uneven and stumbling. She had been running hard, falling often. The blood trail led upstream, toward the rocky outcrop where the creek narrowed and the trees grew thick. Hawaiian touched the bloodstained fabric, feeling its weight, its texture. Whoever wore this dress had been wearing it for days, maybe weeks. The dirt ground into the hem spoke of long travel and desperate flight. He followed the trail with his rifle in hand, moving silent as smoke through the undergrowth. The forest here was dense enough to hide a dozen men, and he had learned long ago never to assume he was alone. After a quarter mile, he found her collapsed beside a fallen cottonwood, half buried in a drift of yellow leaves. She was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair matted with dirt and pine needles. Her dress was torn in a dozen places, and her hands were scraped raw. A wound on her left shoulder had bled through the makeshift bandage she had tied with strips of her own petticoat. Her breathing came shallow and quick, the breath of someone whose body had pushed beyond its limits and was now paying the price. Hawaiian approached carefully, watching for any sign that this might be a trap. He had seen too many tricks, too many ambushes disguised as vulnerability. But when he knelt beside her and saw her face, he knew this woman's suffering was no performance. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin burned by sun and wind. Her eyes moving beneath closed lids as though she was running even in unconsciousness. He touched her forehead. Fever burned beneath his palm. Without water and shelter, she would be dead before nightfall. Hawaiian looked back the way he had come, then forward along her trail. No sounds of pursuit yet, but that meant nothing. Men who hunted people rarely announced themselves with noise. He lifted her carefully, feeling how light she was, how little flesh remained between her bones and skin. She stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her throat, but did not wake. Hawaiian carried her back toward his cabin, moving quickly but carefully, always listening, always watching. The cabin appeared suddenly among the trees, built low and dark so it seemed part of the hillside itself. He had designed it that way deliberately, a place that could be passed by without being seen. Inside, the single room smelled of wood smoke and sage, buckskin, and the sharp tang of animal pelts hanging from the rafters. A small iron stove stood against one wall, a narrow bed against another. Hawaiian laid her on the bed and built up the fire. He fetched water from the creek, heated it in a kettle, and began cleaning her wounds with strips of clean cloth. The shoulder wound was deep but clean, a bullet graze that had torn through muscle without striking bone. She would heal if infection did not set in. As he worked, her eyes opened. They were gray, the color of winter sky, and they fixed on him with a mixture of terror and confusion. She tried to speak, but only a rasping sound emerged. Hawenten held a cup of water to her lips. "Drink slowly," he said in English, though. His accent carried the rhythm of his mother tongue beneath it. She drank, coughed, drank again. Her eyes never left his face. When she finally found her voice, it came out broken and desperate. "They will kill you if they find me here," she whispered. "Please, you have to let me go. I cannot bring this on you." Hawakan sat back on his heels, studying her. "You will not make it another mile in your condition. Who is hunting you?" She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she might not answer. Then she spoke, and her words came out in a rush, as though she had been holding them inside for so long that they could no longer be contained. "My name is Margaret Flynn. My husband and I had a freight business in Deadwood. We hauled supplies to the mining camps, delivered mail, carried payroll. 3 months ago, we took a job from a man named Silas Cord. He runs the largest mining operation in the hills, the Broken Crown Mine." Hawakan knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew Silas Cord, a man who had grown rich on gold torn from sacred ground, a man who bought law and sold justice. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger even as tears began to track down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Silas hired us to transport a strongbox to the bank in Rapid City. $10,000 in gold dust and nuggets. My husband Thomas, he was an honest man. He did not look inside other people's cargo, did not ask questions that were not his business. But something about that job felt wrong from the start. Silas insisted we travel at night, take the old trail through the Badlands where no one goes anymore." She paused to catch her breath, and Hawakan waited. He had learned patience in the long years of solitude, learned that some stories needed their own time to be told. "We were 2 days out when they came. 6 men, all wearing masks, all carrying rifles. They surrounded our wagon before we even knew they were there. Thomas tried to reason with them, told them we were just hauling cargo, that we did not want trouble. They shot him anyway. Shot him. Right in front of me, like his life meant nothing." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the sob that wanted to escape. Hawakan's jaw tightened. He had seen too much of this in his lifetime. Too many good people murdered for gold that would buy nothing but more blood. "They took the strongbox," Margaret continued after a moment, "but then I heard them talking. They were not bandits. They worked for Silas Cord. The whole thing was staged. Silas had hired them to rob his own shipment so he could collect the insurance money and keep the gold. My husband was just a loose end to be tied off." She looked at Hawakan with eyes that had lost any remaining innocence they might have once held. "I ran. I do not know how I got away, but I ran. I have been running for 6 weeks, sleeping in caves and under trees, eating whatever I could find, always moving because I knew they would be coming. Silas cannot afford to let me live. I am the only witness to what he did. If I talk, he loses everything." Hawakan stood and walked to the window. Through the gap in the deerskin curtain, he could see the forest stretching down toward the creek. Everything looked peaceful, but he knew better than to trust appearances. Men like Silas Cord did not leave witnesses alive, and they did not give up the hunt. "How many are tracking you?" he asked without turning around. "I saw 4 riders 2 days ago, near the Cheyenne River. I do not know if there are more. 4 men. Maybe more. All willing to kill to protect Silas Cord's secret." Hawakan felt the old familiar weight settling onto his shoulders, the weight of a choice that could not be unmade once it was committed to. He could turn her out, send her on her way, let her fate be whatever it would be. He had earned his solitude through blood and sacrifice. He had turned his back on the world of men and their endless cruelties. No one could fault him for wanting to keep it that way, but even as the thought formed, he knew it was a lie. He would fault himself. He would carry her ghost alongside all the others that haunted his sleep. "You will stay here until you are strong enough to travel," he said, turning back to face her. Then we will decide what comes next. Relief flooded Margaret's face, followed immediately by fear. You do not understand. These men, they will not stop. When they find this place, they will burn it to the ground with both of us inside. I have seen what they do to anyone who gets in their way. Hawakan picked up his rifle and checked the load. The weapon was old, but well maintained, a Winchester Model 1873 that had never failed him. I understand better than you think, he said quietly. I have known men like Silas Cord. I have fought men like the ones he sends. The difference now is that I am choosing this fight instead of having it chosen for me. Margaret stared at him, this strange native man who lived alone in the forest, and spoke with a calm that seemed almost unnatural given the danger they faced. Why would you risk your life for someone you do not even know? She asked. Hawakan was silent for a long moment. Outside, a raven called from the pines, its voice harsh and lonely. When he finally spoke, his words came from a place deep inside, a place he rarely let anyone see. 8 years ago, I made a choice that cost innocent people their lives. I chose safety over courage, silence over truth. I have lived with that choice every day since. And it has eaten at me like a wolf gnawing its own leg to escape a trap. He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw depths of pain that matched her own. I will not make that choice again. The rest of that day passed in tense quiet. Hawakan prepared what defenses he could, checking his ammunition, filling water containers, clearing sight lines around the cabin. Margaret slept fitfully, waking often with small cries that spoke of nightmares she could not escape even in unconsciousness. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood, Hawakan stood on his porch and looked out over the land he had claimed as his sanctuary. Somewhere out there, men were coming. Men with rifles and ropes and no mercy in their hearts. Part of him wondered if he should have turned Margaret away, should have clung to his solitude and let the world's darkness wash past him one more time. But a larger part, the part that remembered who he had been before grief and guilt had driven him into exile, knew that some fights choose you whether you want them or not. The first tracker arrived just before dawn. Moving through the forest like a shadow that had learned to walk upright, Hawakan had not slept. He never did when danger was close, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath waiting for violence to break loose. He had positioned himself on the ridge above his cabin, hidden among a cluster of boulders where he could watch the approaches without being seen. Margaret was still inside, her fever finally broken, but her body too weak to do much more than sit up and drink the broth he had made from dried venison. The tracker was good. Hawakan would give him that much. He moved with the deliberate caution of a man who had hunted humans before and knew that carelessness was the difference between collecting a bounty and becoming a corpse. He wore buckskins darkened with grease to prevent them from making noise, and his rifle was wrapped in cloth to keep metal from glinting in the early light. Hawakan watched him circle the cabin twice, studying the ground, looking for signs. The man knelt beside the creek where Hawakan had fetched water the day before, examining the boot prints left in the soft mud. Then he looked up toward the hillside, his eyes scanning the tree line with the patience of a predator who knew his prey was close. For a moment, their eyes almost met across the distance. Hawakan remained perfectly still, his body blending with the rocks and scrub pine around him. The tracker stared for a long time at the exact spot where Hawakan crouched, but finally his gaze moved on. He had not seen, but he had sensed. That made him dangerous. The tracker withdrew back into the forest, moving north along the creek. Hawakan knew what would come next. The man would report back to whoever was leading this hunt, and they would come in force. One man could be avoided or ambushed. A group would surround the cabin and wait until starvation or desperation drove its occupants out into the open. Hawakan made his way back down to the cabin. Entering through the rear door he had built for exactly this kind of situation. Margaret was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, and the question in her eyes needed no words. "They found us," Hawakan said simply. "One man so far, but more will come. We have perhaps until midday before they return." Margaret's face went pale, but to her credit, she did not cry or panic. Instead, she stood up, testing her strength, and nodded. "Then we need to leave now before they come back. You have done more than anyone could ask. Show me which direction to go, and I will take my chances." Hawakan shook his head. "You would not make it 5 miles. Your body is still healing, and they know these hills as well as I do. Running now would only mean dying tired instead of dying rested." "Then what do you suggest?" Margaret asked. And there was steel beneath the fear in her voice. Hawakan walked to the stone fireplace and removed several loose rocks from the base, revealing a hollow space behind them. From this cache he pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of metal on metal. "There is a town called Redemption Ridge, 2 days' ride to the east. It is small, but it has a telegraph office and a federal marshal who is not in Silas Cord's pocket. His name is William Creed, and he is one of the few honest lawmen left in this territory." He opened the pouch and poured out a collection of silver dollars and gold eagles. Money he had saved from years of selling furs and hides. "You will take my fastest horse and ride for Redemption Ridge. Do not stop, do not rest longer than the horse needs. When you get there, find Marshal Creed and tell him everything. He will protect you while he investigates your claims." Margaret stared at the money, then at Hawakan. "What about you? If I take your horse, how will you escape when they come?" "I will not be escaping," Hawakan said quietly. "I will be buying you time." Understanding dawned in Margaret's eyes, followed by horror. "No, I will not let you sacrifice yourself for me. We can both ride, we can both run. On one horse, carrying 2 people, with you still weak from injury and fever. They would run us down before sunset." Hawakan's voice was firm, but not unkind. "This is the only way that gives you a real chance." Margaret grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the worn leather of his shirt. "There has to be another way. Please, I have already lost my husband. I cannot have another death on my conscience." Hawakan gently removed her hand from his arm and held it between both of his own. His skin was rough and scarred, marked by a lifetime of hard use, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "Some debts can only be paid in one coin," he said. "I told you yesterday that I made a choice 8 years ago that cost innocent lives. I did not tell you the whole story." He released her hand and walked to the window, looking out at the forest that had been his refuge and his prison. "I was a scout for the army during the last years of the wars. I guided columns of soldiers through Lakota and Cheyenne territory, helped them find the camps they wanted to destroy. I told myself I was helping to end the fighting, that peace would come faster if one side had overwhelming force. I was a fool." His voice carried the weight of old pain, old shame. There was a village on the Powder River, mostly women and children and old men. The warriors were away hunting. The colonel I was guiding wanted to attack anyway, said it would send a message. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was murder dressed up as war. But I stayed silent. I led them there anyway. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "They killed everyone," Hawakan continued, his voice flat now, drained of emotion because feeling it would break him. "Burned the lodges, shot the horses, left nothing alive. I can still hear the screaming when I close my eyes. I can still smell the smoke." He turned back to face her, and she saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I left the army the next day. I came to these hills and I built this cabin, and I told myself that if I just stayed away from people, stayed away from their wars and their hatreds, then I could somehow balance the scales. But scales do not balance through absence. They balance through action." Margaret was crying now too, understanding the depth of guilt that had driven this man into 8 years of solitude. "So you see," Hawakan said softly, "this is not sacrifice. This is payment for a debt long overdue. When those men come, I will stand my ground. I will give you every hour, every minute I can buy. And maybe, if there is any justice in the universe, my death will mean something more than my life has." "No," Margaret said firmly, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. "No, I reject that. Your life means something right now to me. And I will not accept your death as payment for sins you have already paid for 100 times over in loneliness and grief." Before Hawakan could respond, a sound drifted through the morning air. Voices, distant but growing closer. The hunters were returning, and they had brought reinforcements. Hawakan moved quickly, gathering supplies into a leather saddlebag. He added dried meat, hardtack, a canteen of water, and the pouch of coins. Then he led Margaret out the back door to where his horses were corralled in a small clearing behind the cabin. He had 2 animals, both sturdy mountain ponies bred for endurance rather than speed. He saddled the younger one, a gray mare with intelligent eyes and a calm temperament. "Her name is Wakigyak," Hawakan said as he worked. "It means thunder. She will carry you safely if you trust her." He helped Margaret into the saddle, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs. She sat unsteadily at first, still weak, but determination set her jaw firm. "Follow the creek east for 3 miles, then turn north when you reach the split pine. Stay in the low ground where the trees are thickest. Do not use the main trails. Wakijak knows the way, trust her instincts." The voices were closer now. Hawakan could make out individual words, rough laughter. The casual cruelty of men who believed their strength made them righteous. "Go now," Hawakan said, slapping the mare's flank. But Margaret pulled the reins, stopping the horse. She looked down at Hawakan with eyes that held more emotion than words could carry. "What is your full name?" "You told me Blue Hawk, but not the rest." "Hawakan Hehakaska," he said. "It means mysterious voice of the white elk." "Then listen to me, Hawakan Hehakaska," Margaret said, her voice strong despite the tears on her face. "You are not a man paying a debt. You are a man choosing courage over fear. That is not the same thing. Do you understand me? That is not the same thing." Before he could answer, she kicked the mare into motion and disappeared into the trees, the sound of hoofbeats fading quickly into the vast silence of the forest. Hawakan stood alone in the clearing, feeling the weight of solitude settle over him one final time. But it was different now. For 8 years, his solitude had been a punishment, a cage he had built with his own hands. Now it was a choice, a weapon, a gift he was giving to someone who deserved to live. He walked back into his cabin and began preparing for war. He had 3 rifles, 2 pistols, and enough ammunition to make any assault costly. He positioned the rifles at different windows, creating the illusion of multiple defenders. He filled pots and buckets with water in case they tried to burn him out. He moved furniture to create barriers that would stop bullets and force attackers to expose themselves. When everything was ready, he sat down in his chair near the cold fireplace and waited. Outside, the voices grew louder, more confident. They thought they had cornered their prey. They thought this would be easy, Hawakan smiled grimly. Let them think that. Let them believe their numbers and their weapons made them invincible. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous opponent was not the strongest or the fastest, but the one with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The cabin door burst open and a man stepped inside, rifle raised. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest that meant nothing in this lawless place. Behind him, 3 more men crowded into the doorway. "Where is she?" the man with the badge demanded. Hawakan looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only a calm certainty that seemed to unsettle the intruders. "Gone," he said simply. The man's face twisted with rage. "You are lying. We tracked her straight to this cabin. She is here, and you are going to tell us where?" "I said she is gone." Hawakan repeated. She left hours ago. You will not find her. The man stepped closer, his rifle barrel now pointing directly at Hawakan's chest. Then you are no use to us anymore. Are you? Hawakan did not move, did not flinch. He met the man's eyes with a steady gaze that seemed to look through him to something beyond. No, he agreed. I suppose I am not. The man with the badge studied Hawakan for a long moment, his finger resting on the trigger. Then he lowered his rifle slightly and turned to the others. Search every corner of this place. Check under the floor, check the rafters, check anywhere a person could hide. And you, he jabbed the rifle barrel toward Hawakan. Do not move a muscle or I will put a hole through you just for the pleasure of it. The men spread out through the small cabin, overturning furniture, tearing through Hawakan's belongings with the casual destruction of people who had never built anything themselves and therefore placed no value on what others had created. They ripped open his storage trunks, scattered his carefully preserved herbs and medicines, trampled the winter provisions he had laid in with such care. Hawakan watched it all with the detachment of a man who had already surrendered his attachment to material things. These were just objects, just possessions. They could be replaced or they could be lost. It made no difference in the end. What mattered was the woman riding east toward safety, putting more distance between herself and these men with every passing minute. One of the searchers, a wiry man with a scar running down his left cheek, emerged from checking the back room and shook his head. Nothing, Rafe. If she was here, she ain't here now. The man with the badge, apparently named Rafe, turned back to Hawakan with eyes gone cold and hard. When did she leave? I told you. Hours ago. Which direction? I did not notice. Rafe moved faster than Hawakan expected for a man his size. The rifle butt caught Hawakan across the jaw, snapping his head to the side and filling his mouth with blood. Pain exploded through his face, but he had felt worse. Much worse. Do not play games with me, savage, Rafe snarled. You helped her, which means you are part of this now. Silas Cord wants that woman dead, and anyone who helps her shares her fate. So I will ask you one more time, which direction did she go? Hawakan spat blood onto his own floor and looked up at Rafe with eyes that held no fear. No submission, only a quiet defiance that seemed to enrage the man further. If Silas Cord wants her so badly, perhaps he should do his own hunting instead of sending dogs to do it for him. This time the blow came from a fist, catching Hawakan in the ribs with enough force to crack bone. He doubled over, gasping, but he did not cry out. He would give them nothing, no sound, no satisfaction, no information. Rafe grabbed Hawakan by the hair and yanked his head back, forcing him to meet his gaze. You think you are brave? You think this is courage? You are just a fool who is going to die slowly and painfully for nothing. That woman is dead already, she just does not know it yet. We have men watching every trail, every town, every place she might run to. She will not make it 2 days. Then why do you need me to tell you where she went? Hawakan managed through split lips. The question hung in the air like smoke. Rafe's face flushed red with anger, but beneath the anger Hawakan saw something else. Uncertainty. Fear. These men were not as confident as they pretended to be. They had lost Margaret's trail, and they knew that every hour she remained free was another hour she could reach someone who might actually listen to her story. Rafe released Hawakan's hair and stepped back, visibly trying to control his temper. He turned to the other men. Burn it. Burn everything. The cabin, the barn, the corrals. Leave nothing standing. If he will not talk, then he can watch everything he built turn to ash. Maybe that will loosen his tongue. The men moved immediately to obey, gathering anything that would burn and piling it against the walls. One of them produced a tin of kerosene and began splashing it across Hawakan's belongings. Across the bed where he had slept for 8 years. Across the table where he had eaten 1,000 solitary meals. Hawakan felt a flicker of pain watching his sanctuary being prepared for destruction. But he pushed it down. This place had been his prison as much as his refuge.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Perhaps burning it was the only way to truly be free of what it represented. "Last chance," Rafe said, striking a match and holding it up so the flame danced in the dim light. "Tell me where she went, and I will make your death quick. Keep silent, and you will burn alive in this box you call home." Hawakan looked at the match, at the flame that would soon consume everything he owned. Then he looked at Rafe and smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to come from someplace deep and true. "Do you know what the difference is between us?" Hawakan asked quietly. Rafe frowned, confused by the question. "The difference is that I am not afraid to die," Hawakan continued. "I made my peace with death a long time ago. But you are terrified. I can see it in your eyes, in the way your hands shake when you think no one is watching. You are afraid that Margaret Flynn will reach someone who matters, that your employer's crimes will be exposed, that all the money and power in the world will not save you from the consequences of what you have done." "Shut your mouth," Rafe hissed. But there was no conviction in it. "You are right to be afraid," Hawakan said. "Because she will make it. She will reach Redemption Ridge, and she will find Marshal Creed, and she will tell him everything. And when she does, all of this, all of your threats and your violence and your attempts to silence the truth, it will mean nothing." Rafe's hand trembled as he held the match. For a moment, Hawakan thought the man might actually set the fire. Then Rafe cursed and threw the match to the ground, stamping it out with his boot. "Tie him up," he ordered the others. "We are taking him with us. Silas will want to question him personally, and I am not about to face the old man empty-handed." The men grabbed Hawakan roughly, binding his wrists and ankles with coarse rope that bit into his skin. They dragged him outside and threw him over the back of a horse like a sack of grain. The world inverted, and Hawakan found himself staring at the ground as blood rushed to his head. As they rode away from his cabin, Hawakan twisted his neck enough to catch one last glimpse of the place that had been his home. It still stood, smoke-stained but unburned, a monument to 8 years of self-imposed exile. He wondered if he would ever see it again, and found that he did not particularly care. The ride was brutal. Tied face down across the horse's back, every jolt and stumble sent fresh waves of pain through Hawakan's battered body. His ribs screamed with every breath, his jaw throbbed where Rafe had struck him, and the ropes cut deeper into his wrists with each mile. But through all the pain, one thought kept him anchored, kept him conscious and alert. Margaret was still free. Every minute they wasted bringing him to Silas Cord was another minute she had to reach safety. His suffering was buying her time, buying her distance, buying her life. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, the horses slowed and then stopped. Hawakan heard voices, many voices, and the sounds of a large camp. They had arrived at the Broken Crown mine. Rough hands dragged him off the horse and dumped him on the ground. Hawakan lay there for a moment, gathering his strength, assessing his situation. Through slitted eyes, he could see dozens of men moving about, miners and guards and roughnecks of every description. This was Silas Cord's kingdom, built on stolen gold and the broken backs of desperate men. Someone grabbed him by the collar and hauled him upright. Hawakan found himself face to face with a man who could only be Silas Cord himself. He was in his 60s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that held all the warmth of a winter grave. He wore an expensive suit that looked absurd in this rough mining camp, as though he was playing at being civilized while orchestrating murder. "So this is the man who helped Margaret Flynn escape," Silas said, his voice cultured and smooth. "I must admit, I am curious. What possible reason could you have for involving yourself in affairs that do not concern you?" Hawakan met his gaze steadily. "A woman asked for help. I gave it. No other reason is needed. Silas smiled, but it was the smile of a snake watching a mouse. How wonderfully primitive. How noble. How utterly foolish. He turned to Rafe. Did he tell you where she went? No, sir. He would not talk. I see. Silas studied Hoboken with the cold calculation of a man who had spent a lifetime measuring the worth of other human beings in dollars and cents. Well, we shall see how long that lasts. Take him to the holding shed. I will deal with him once we have recovered Mrs. Flynn. As the men dragged Hoboken away, Silas called after him. You should have stayed in whatever hole you crawled out of, savage. Now you will die for nothing, and no one will even remember your name. But Hoboken knew better. Margaret would remember. And sometimes that was enough. The holding shed was little more than a wooden box with a dirt floor and walls that let in slivers of daylight through gaps in the planking. They threw Hoboken inside and locked the heavy door behind him, leaving him in near darkness that smelled of old sweat and fear and the copper tang of dried blood. He was not the first person to be held here, and the stains on the floor suggested that not everyone who entered this place left it alive. Hoboken worked his way into a sitting position against the back wall, testing the ropes that bound his wrists. They were tight by someone who knew their craft, but not impossible. Everything could be escaped given enough time and determination. The question was whether he would have either. His ribs ached with every breath, sharp pains that suggested at least one was cracked, if not broken. His jaw had swollen where Rafe had struck him, and he could feel dried blood crusting on his face. But pain was an old companion, and Hoboken had learned long ago how to move through it rather than against it. He closed his eyes and let his mind travel beyond the walls of his prison. Somewhere out there, Margaret was riding hard toward Redemption Ridge, if she maintained the pace he had set for her. If she trusted Wakigiak to find the safest paths. If her body held together despite its recent trauma. She could reach the town by tomorrow evening. 2 days maximum, 2 days. Hoboken needed to stay alive for 2 days, maybe 3 to be certain. After that, it would not matter what Silas Cord did to him. Margaret would have told her story to Marshal Creed, and the law, however imperfect, would begin moving against the men who had murdered her husband and stolen his employer's gold. The door rattled and swung open, flooding the shed with afternoon light that made Hoboken squint. 2 men entered, neither of them Rafe. One was older, gray-bearded and heavy-set, with the look of someone who had spent too many years doing work that corroded the soul. The other was younger, maybe 30, with nervous eyes that kept darting toward the door, as though he expected trouble to walk through it at any moment. The older man carried a wooden stool, which he set down a few feet from where Hoboken sat. He lowered himself onto it with a grunt and studied Hoboken the way a butcher might study a side of beef. "Name's Garrett," he said without preamble. "I have worked for Mr. Cord for 15 years, and in that time I have had to do things I am not particularly proud of. But I have always done them because Mr. Cord pays well, and because the alternative to working for him in this territory is starving or getting robbed by someone less organized." He paused, waiting to see if Hoboken would respond. When silence was his only answer, Garrett continued, "Now Mr. Cord wants to know where Margaret Flynn is headed. He also wants to know if you told anyone else about her. If she has allies we should be concerned about. And whether you have any idea what kind of trouble you have brought down on yourself by helping her." "I told her to run," Hoboken said quietly. "I did not ask where." "I did not need to know." Garrett sighed heavily. "That is a shame. It truly is. Because now I have to try to make you tell me. And experience has taught me that men like you, men with that look in their eyes, you do not break easy. Some do not break at all. And then I have wasted everyone's time and accomplished nothing except adding another body to the pile." He stood up from the stool and motioned to the younger man, who reluctantly stepped forward carrying a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of metal tools. "I will give you one more chance to save us all a lot of unpleasantness," Garrett said. Tell me what I need to know, and I will make sure your end is quick and clean. A bullet to the head, no pain, no suffering. You will just go to sleep and not wake up. That is more mercy than most men in your position receive. Hawakan looked at the satchel, at the shapes of pliers and knives pressing against the leather, at the dark stains that suggested these tools had been used for their grim purpose many times before. He thought about the pain that was coming, about how much his body could endure before his mind broke or his heart simply stopped. Then he thought about Margaret, about the determination in her gray eyes, about the way she had insisted he was not paying a debt but choosing courage. He thought about the village on the Powder River, about the screams he still heard in his nightmares, about 8 years of running from a past he could never outrun. No, he said simply. Garrett's expression did not change. If anything, he looked tired, as though he had expected this answer and regretted being right. Then we do this the hard way. What followed was pain beyond anything Hawakan had experienced in a lifetime that had not been gentle. Garrett worked with the efficiency of long practice, knowing exactly where to apply pressure to maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of accidental death. The younger man held Hawakan down when he struggled, looked away when the screaming started. Through it all, Hawakan tried to hold on to one thought, one truth that could anchor him against the storm of agony. Margaret was riding east. Every second he refused to break was another second she had to escape. His pain was buying her freedom, and that made it bearable. Or at least gave it meaning. Time became meaningless, measured only in waves of torment that crashed over him and then receded, leaving him gasping and shaking until the next wave began. At some point, he realized he was screaming words in Lakota, prayers and curses and the names of ancestors long dead. At another point, he found himself laughing, a broken sound that seemed to unnerve even Garrett finally. Garrett stepped back and wiped his hands on a rag that came away red. Enough, he said to the younger man. He is not going to talk. Some men just do not have that breaking point. Or they bury it so deep you would kill them trying to find it. The younger man looked relieved to be done, his face pale and sick. What do we tell Mr. Cord? The truth. The savage does not know where she went, or if he does, he would rather die than tell us. Either way, we are wasting time here that could be spent actually hunting her down. They left, taking the stool and the satchel of tools with them. The doors swung shut, and darkness returned to the holding shed. Hawakan lay on the dirt floor, his body a map of pain, his breathing shallow and ragged. Blood pooled beneath him, warm and sticky, soaking into the earth, but he was still alive, still conscious, still holding the one piece of information they needed and could not break out of him. That had to count for something. Hours passed or maybe days. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. Hawakan drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to find himself speaking to people who were not there. His mother, who had died when he was young. His brother, killed in a cavalry raid 30 years ago. The children from the Powder River village asking him why he had not saved them. At one point, he woke to find someone kneeling beside him in the darkness. He could not see their face, but he felt hands gently cleaning his wounds, heard a woman's voice whispering words he could not quite understand. When he tried to focus to see who it was, the figure faded away like smoke, then the door opened again. And this time it was Silas Cord himself who entered, carrying a lantern that filled the shed with flickering yellow light. He stood over Hawakan, looking down at the broken man on the floor with an expression that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "You are a stubborn fool," Silas said conversationally. "Garrett tells me you endured 3 hours of persuasion without saying a useful word. I find that simultaneously impressive and idiotic. What loyalty do you owe to Margaret Flynn? You barely know her." Hawakan managed to focus his eyes on Silas's face. "I know enough." "Do you?" Silas crouched down, bringing himself to Hawakan's level. "Let me tell you what you do not know. You do not know that Thomas Flynn was skimming from my shipments, pocketing gold dust, and thinking I would not notice. You do not know that when I confronted him about it, he pulled a gun on my men. The shooting was self-defense, pure and simple. Lies, Hawken whispered. Are they? Or is that what Margaret told you, and you believed her because she looked helpless and frightened? Women are very good at playing the victim, especially when they are covering for their own crimes. Silas stood up again, brushing dirt from his expensive trousers. I am a businessman. I did not build the Broken Crown mine by being sentimental or by letting thieves steal from me with impunity. Thomas Flynn stole from me, and he paid the price. His widow is spreading lies to cover her own complicity. And you have thrown your life away protecting the criminal. Hawken could feel doubt trying to creep in at the edges of his mind. Exhaustion and pain making him vulnerable to Silas's smooth words. But then he remembered Margaret's eyes when she told her story, the rawness of her grief, the specific details that could not be fabricated. You are the liar, Hawken said, his voice stronger now. You staged the robbery. Your own men killed Thomas Flynn. Margaret is the only witness, and you want her dead before she can tell anyone what she knows. Silas's expression hardened. Believe what you want. It makes no difference now. My men are scouring every trail between here and the nearest towns. Margaret Flynn will not reach help. She will die alone in the wilderness, and her story will die with her. As for you, he turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. I could kill you now. It would be the merciful thing to do. But mercy requires that I believe you deserve it, and I am not convinced you do. So instead, I am going to leave you here. No food, no water, just you and your convictions. We will see how long your noble sacrifice feels worthwhile when you are dying of thirst. Knowing that it accomplished nothing, Silas left, taking the lantern with him. Darkness returned, absolute and suffocating. Hawken lay in the blood-soaked dirt and tried to hold on to hope. Margaret had a full day's head start by now, maybe more. Even if Silas had men searching for her, the Black Hills covered thousands of square miles. Finding one woman who knew how to stay hidden would be like finding a specific grain of sand on an endless beach. But doubt gnawed at him nonetheless. What if he was wrong? What if Margaret's injuries slowed her down more than he had calculated? What if Wekigyak threw a shoe or went lame? What if Silas's men got lucky and cut off the trails before she could reach Redemption Ridge? No. He pushed the doubt away with the same force of will that had kept him silent during Garrett's interrogation. Doubt was poison, and he could not afford to be poisoned now. Margaret would make it. She had to make it. Otherwise, all of this suffering truly was for nothing. Time continued its meaningless passage. Hawken's thirst grew from discomfort to agony, his tongue swelling in his mouth, his lips cracking and bleeding. His wounds stopped bleeding only because his body had no more blood to spare. Fever set in, bringing with it visions and hallucinations that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes terrifying. He saw the village on the Powder River again, but this time the people were alive and whole. Children played among the lodges, women tended cooking fires. Old men sat in council circles and debated the future of their people. They looked at him without accusation. Without anger, only a kind of sad understanding. He saw Margaret reaching Redemption Ridge, saw her sliding from Wakigyag's back and stumbling into the marshal's office. Saw Marshal Creed's face harden as he listened to her story. Saw him gathering men and horses to ride against Silas Cord. Saw justice, imperfect and slow but inexorable, finally beginning to turn its great wheel. He saw his mother, young and beautiful as she had been before sickness took her, sitting beside him in the darkness and singing the old songs he had not heard since childhood. Her hand stroked his hair, cool and gentle, and he felt tears sliding down his ruined face. Then he saw nothing at all. Just darkness and silence, and a peace that felt like the end of a very long journey. The door crashed open, and lantern lights stabbed into the shed like a blade. Hawakan tried to lift his head, but his body no longer obeyed him. Footsteps approached, multiple sets, and voices argued above him in tones he could not quite parse into words. Someone lifted him, and he cried out weakly at the pain that lanced through his broken body. Then he was being carried, the world bouncing and swaying in ways that made his stomach heave. Cool air touched his face, night air filled with the scent of pine and sage. "Is he going to make it?" a voice asked, young and frightened. "I do not know," another voice answered, older and grim. "But we are going to try. God help us, we are going to try." Hawakan tried to understand what was happening, tried to make sense of the voices and the movement and the fact that he was no longer in the holding shed. But consciousness was slipping away from him like water through cupped hands, and there was nothing he could do to hold on to it. His last thought before the darkness took him completely was a simple prayer. Let her have made it. Let my pain have meant something. Let there be justice, even if I do not live to see it. Hawakan woke to the sound of rain drumming on canvas above his head and the smell of wood. Smoke mixed with something medicinal and sharp. For a long moment, he could not remember where he was or how he had gotten there. The last clear memory was the holding shed, darkness, thirst so terrible it felt like his throat was lined with broken glass. Everything after that existed only as fragments, disconnected images that might have been real or might have been fever dreams. He tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain flared through his entire body, but it was different now, cleaner somehow, as though someone had taken the raw edges of his injuries and smoothed them into something more manageable. He forced his eyes open and found himself staring at the sloped interior of a canvas tent, rain shadows dancing across the fabric. "Easy now," a voice said from somewhere to his left. "You have been unconscious for 2 days. Your body needs rest, not movement." Hawakan turned his head slowly and saw a man sitting on a camp stool beside what appeared to be a makeshift cot. The man was perhaps 60 years old, with a lined face and gray hair pulled back in a tail. He wore simple clothes, buckskin pants, and a cotton shirt, and his hands were stained with what looked like herbal preparations. "Who are you?" Hawakan managed, his voice coming out as barely more than a croak. "My name is Samuel Bridger. I run a trading post about 15 miles north of Silas Cord's mine. Some folks came to me 3 nights ago and said there was a man being held prisoner who needed help. So I gathered a few friends who are not fond of Silas's way of doing business, and we went to get you out." Samuel reached for a tin cup on the small table beside him and held it to Hawakan's lips. Water, cool and clean, the most beautiful thing Hawakan had ever tasted. He drank slowly, fighting the urge to gulp it down, knowing his body would reject too much too fast. "The woman," Hawakan said when he could speak again. "Margaret Flynn. Did she make it to Redemption Ridge?" Samuel's expression remained neutral. "I do not know. We have not had word from that direction yet. But the fact that Silas's men are still searching tells me they have not caught her, which is something." Hope and uncertainty warred in Hawakan's chest. Still searching meant still alive, still free, still moving toward safety. But it also meant the danger was not past, that everything could still go wrong in 100 different ways. "How did you know I was there?" Hawakan asked. "How did you know to come?" Samuel smiled slightly. "A young man named Peter works in the mine as a powder monkey. He saw them bring you in, heard Garrett bragging about how you would not break no matter what they did to you. Peter's got a conscience, which is a rare thing in that camp. He slipped away and rode to my post, told me what was happening. Where is he now? Safe, I hope. He cannot go back to the mine, not after helping us. Silas would kill him slow for the betrayal. I gave him money and a horse and told him to ride for Colorado. Young enough to start over somewhere Silas Cord's reach does not extend." Hawakan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of yet another person who had risked everything because of his choices. Peter, Samuel, the unnamed friends who had helped stage the rescue. All of them now marked men if Silas ever discovered their involvement. "You should not have come for me," Hoakan said quietly. I am nobody. Just an old scout trying to pay a debt. That is where you are wrong, Samuel replied firmly. Word spreads fast in these hills. Everyone knows about the native man who stood up to Silas Cord's hired guns, who took a beating rather than betray someone who needed help. That kind of courage matters. It reminds people that there is still something worth standing for in this God-forsaken territory. Before Hawekan could respond, the tent flap pushed open and the woman entered, shaking rain from her shawl. She was native, perhaps 40 years old, with strong features and eyes that assessed Hawekan with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew medicine. He is awake, she said to Samuel, then approached the cot and began checking Hawekan's wounds with gentle but thorough hands. Good, the fever broke last night. I was worried the infection had gone too deep. This is Winona, Samuel explained. She is the reason you are still alive. Without her herbs and knowledge, you would have died from sepsis before we got you halfway here. Winona made a dismissive sound. He is alive because he is too stubborn to die. The herbs just reminded his body what it already wanted to do. She pulled back the blanket covering Hawekan, and he saw for the first time the extent of his injuries. His torso was wrapped in clean bandages, his ribs bound tight. His hands were covered in poultices that smelled of sage and something else he could not identify. Bruises covered every visible inch of skin in shades of purple, black and sickly yellow. You will heal, Winona said matter-of-factly, but it will take time. Weeks, maybe months before you are back to full strength. The ribs are cracked but not broken completely. The burns on your hands will scar, but you will keep your fingers. The internal damage, that is harder to assess. But you are passing water normally and keeping down food. So nothing vital was destroyed. She replaced the blanket and fixed him with a stern look. What you will not do is try to leave this tent for at least a week. You will rest, you will eat what I bring you, and you will let your body repair itself. Do you understand? Hawekan found himself nodding despite the part of him that wanted to argue. Wanted to get up and find out what had happened to Margaret. Wanted to finish what he had started. Winona seemed to read his thoughts. The woman you helped, if she made it to Redemption Ridge, then the law is already moving. If she did not make it, then there is nothing you can do for her now. Either way, you dying from your injuries helps no one. So rest. She left as abruptly as she had entered, and Samuel chuckled. She has a way with words, does Winona. But she is right. You did your part. Now you need to trust that it was enough. The next week passed in a blur of sleeping and waking, eating thin broths that gradually thickened into stews, and enduring Winona's ministrations as she changed his bandages and applied fresh poultices. Samuel visited regularly, bringing news from the outside world that filtered through the network of trappers and traders who moved through these hills. Silas Cord's men were still searching, growing more desperate and violent as days passed without finding Margaret. They had burned 2 abandoned homesteads thinking she might be hiding there, and beaten a trapper who refused to answer their questions. The whole territory was starting to turn against Cecilis. People whispering that he had gone too far this time, that even the rich and powerful had limits to what they could get away with. On the 8th day, Hawekan was finally strong enough to sit up without help and walk a few steps around the tent before exhaustion forced him back to the cot. It was progress, and he clung to it like a drowning man clings to driftwood. That evening, as rain continued to fall in steady sheets outside, Samuel entered the tent with an expression Hawekan had not seen before. Excitement mixed with apprehension, the look of a man carrying news that would change everything. A rider came through an hour ago, Samuel said without preamble. From Redemption Ridge, Margaret Flynn made it. She reached Marshal Creed 5 days ago, told him everything, and he believed her. He sent telegrams to the territorial governor and to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. They are sending investigators and federal troops to shut down Silas Cord's operation and arrest everyone involved in Thomas Flynn's murder. Relief hit Hawoken like a physical force, so intense it made his eyes burn with unshed tears. She had made it. Despite her injuries, despite the men hunting her, despite everything that could have gone wrong, Margaret Flynn had reached safety and told her story to someone who would listen. When? Hawoken asked, his voice unsteady. When are they coming? That is the complicated part, Samuel said, sitting down heavily on his stool. The federal troops need time to mobilize. They are talking about 2 weeks, maybe 3, before they can get enough men here to take on Silas and his private army.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
In the meantime, Marshal Creed has issued warrants for Silas Cord, Rafe Kenton, and 6 other men by name. But warrants do not mean much when the men they are meant for have 50 armed guards and a mountain stronghold. They will run, Hawoken said with certainty. Silas is smart enough to know when the game is over. He will take whatever gold he can carry and disappear before the federal troops arrive. That is exactly what people are afraid of. If Silas runs, he takes his secrets with him. All the other crimes he has committed, all the other people he has hurt or killed, they all go unpunished. Justice delayed becomes justice denied. Hawoken pushed himself up to sitting, ignoring the protest from his ribs. Then someone needs to make sure he does not run. Someone needs to slow him down long enough for the law to arrive. Samuel looked at him with alarm. You cannot be serious. Look at yourself. You can barely walk across this tent. What do you think you could possibly do against Silas Cord? I do not know yet, Hawoken admitted. But I did not survive Garrett's interrogation and 3 days dying in that shed, just to let Silas escape justice. There has to be a way. Before Samuel could argue further, the tent flap opened and 2 men entered, both carrying rifles and wearing expressions of grim determination. Hawoken recognized one of them as the young nervous man who had held him down during the torture session, the one who had looked sick at what Garrett was doing. Peter, Samuel said in surprise. I thought you were halfway to Colorado by now. Peter shook his head. I got as far as the territorial line before my conscience caught up with me. I cannot run from this. I cannot leave and know that I could have done more to stop what Silas is doing. He turned to Hawoken, and there was shame in his eyes. I helped them hurt you. I held you down while Garrett worked his tools. I told myself I had no choice, that I was just following orders. But that is what cowards say when they want to justify the evil they do. I came back to make it right if you will let me. Hawoken studied the young man for a long moment. He could see genuine remorse there, genuine determination to atone. He knew that feeling intimately, had lived with it for 8 years. What did you have in mind? Hawoken asked. The other man stepped forward, older than Peter by a decade, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life working hard for little reward. My name is Jacob Moss. I worked at the Broken Crown until last month when Silas accused me of theft to avoid paying my wages. There are dozens like me, men he has cheated and abused and cast aside. We have been talking, gathering in secret, sharing our grievances. If someone could give us a plan, give us leadership, we could stand against Silas together. How many men are we talking about? Samuel asked. 20, maybe 30 if we count those willing to fight but not eager to lead. Most of us are miners or laborers, not gunfighters. But we know the layout of the mine, we know Silas's routines, and we know which of his guards might turn if given a chance. Hawoken felt something stirring in his chest, something he had not felt in 8 long years. Purpose, not the empty purpose of solitude and penance, but the genuine purpose of standing with others against injustice. You are talking about a siege, Hawoken said slowly, thinking through the logistics. Surrounding the mine, cutting off escape routes, forcing Silas to stay put until the federal troops arrive. More or less, Jacob agreed. We do not have the firepower to assault the place directly. Silas has too many guards, too many defensive positions. But if we could control the roads out, make it impossible for him to flee with his gold, then maybe we buy enough time. It is suicide, Samuel said flatly. Silas will see you coming and cut you down before you get within 100 yards of his outer perimeter. Not if we have help from the inside, Peter interjected. There are men still working the mine who hate Silas as much as we do. If someone could coordinate the external blockade with an internal uprising, we might actually have a chance. Hawakan looked at the three men, saw the hope and fear warring in their faces. They were asking him to lead them, these men who barely knew him. Asking him to risk not just his own life, but theirs in a gambit that had more ways to fail than succeed. 8 years ago, he had chosen silence over action, and people had died. He had spent every day since then trying to atone for that choice, trying to pay a debt that could never truly be settled. But maybe atonement was not about paying debts. Maybe it was about making different choices when the same moment came around again. "Give me 2 days," Hawakan said. 2 days to get strong enough to ride. Then we will plan this properly. We will do reconnaissance, identify the weak points in Silas's defenses, coordinate with the men inside. We will not throw our lives away on a desperate charge. We will be smart, we will be patient, and we will make sure that when the federal troops arrive, they find Silas Cord exactly where he belongs. Trapped, Jacob finished with a grim smile. Samuel shook his head but did not argue further. He knew as well as anyone that some decisions, once made, could not be unmade by reason or caution. 2 days then, he said. But if you get yourself killed after Winona spent a week keeping you alive, I am not going to be the one to tell her. That night, lying alone in the dark tent with rain still falling outside, Hawakan thought about Margaret Flynn riding east toward salvation. He thought about the village on the Powder River and the screams he could never unhear. He thought about 8 years of solitude and the heavy chains of guilt he had wrapped around himself. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt those chains beginning to loosen. Justice was coming to the Black Hills, slow and imperfect, but inexorable. And Hawakan Blue Hawk, the man who had spent 8 years running from his past, was going to make sure it arrived exactly when and where it was needed most. The plan came together over 3 days of careful preparation, whispered meetings in hidden places, and the slow gathering of men who had finally decided that enough was enough. Hawakan spent those days regaining his strength, forcing his battered body to move when it wanted nothing more than rest. Winona protested loudly and frequently, but she also brought him stronger food and exercises that would speed his recovery. She understood, even if she disapproved, that some fights could not be postponed until the body was fully ready. By the 4th day, 32 men had committed to the action. They were a ragged collection of former miners, cheated laborers, trappers who had lost friends to Silas's greed, and a handful of younger men who simply wanted to prove they were more than what this harsh territory had tried to make them. Not an army by any measure, but perhaps enough. They gathered in a box canyon 5 miles from the Broken Crown mine, a natural fortress where they could plan without fear of Silas's scouts discovering them. A map had been drawn in the dirt, stones representing buildings, sticks marking roads and trails, leaves showing the positions of guard posts. Hawakan crouched beside the map, his ribs still aching but manageable now, and pointed to the 3 main routes leading away from the mine. Silas will not abandon his gold lightly, he said to the assembled men. When he decides to run, he will take as much as he can carry. That means wagons, which means he must use one of these roads. The mountain trails are too narrow and steep for heavy loads. Jacob Moss nodded agreement. The eastern road leads to Rapid City, but that is where Marshal Creed is based now. Silas knows the law is waiting for him there. The southern road goes through the Badlands, rough country but passable. The western road connects to the main freight route toward Wyoming territory. So we block all 3, Peter suggested. Split our men, establish positions where we can see any movement. That spreads us too thin, Hawken countered. Silas has at least 40 men under his command. If he sends his full force against one blockade, they will sweep through us like wind through grass. We need to be smarter than that. Samuel Bridger, who had insisted on being part of the planning despite his age, spoke up from where he sat on a fallen log. What if we do not try to stop him directly? What if we make it impossible for him to move the gold at all? All eyes turned to him. And he continued, the mine has one main vault where Silas keeps his processed gold, waiting for the monthly shipment to the bank. According to Peter, it is in the administration building, ground floor, reinforced door, but wooden walls. If that vault were to become inaccessible, say because of a fire or a collapse, Silas would be forced to stay and try to salvage his fortune rather than flee. Hawken considered this, turning the idea over in his mind from different angles. You are suggesting we trap him with his own greed. Make it so he cannot abandon the gold, but also cannot safely extract it. Exactly. And while he is dealing with that crisis, the federal troops arrive and find him still on site, with all the evidence of his crimes right there in the open. It was clever, Hawken had to admit. It turned Silas's greatest strength, his wealth, into a liability. But it also required getting inside the mine compound without being detected, and that was no small feat. We would need people on the inside, Jacob said, echoing Hawken's thoughts. People who work there, who can move around without raising suspicion. I know 3 men who would help, Peter offered. Tom Begley, he is a night watchman. Marcus Shaw works the smelter. And old Dutch Hansen, he has been there longer than anyone, and Silas trusts him because he thinks Dutch is too old and tired to cause trouble. But Dutch's son died in a tunnel collapse that Silas could have prevented if he had spent money on proper support timbers instead of lining his own pockets. Can you get word to them without tipping off Silas's loyalists? Hawken asked. I can try. There are ways to pass messages in the mine, signals we developed to warn each other when foremen were in bad moods or when inspections were coming. If I can get close enough without being recognized. Too risky, Samuel interrupted. Silas's men are looking for you specifically. But I still do business with the mine, supplying tools and equipment. No one would question me making a delivery. They worked out the details as the sun tracked across the sky and shadows grew long in the canyon. Samuel would make contact with the inside men, passing along the plan and the timeline. Peter and Jacob would organize the external forces, positioning them to respond once the internal action began. Hawken would lead a small group whose job was to create diversions and keep Silas's attention divided. As evening fell and the men dispersed to their assigned tasks, Winona approached Hawken with a bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Supplies, she said curtly. Bandages, herbs for pain, powder to prevent infection. Your wounds are not fully healed. If you tear them open again, these will help keep you alive long enough to finish whatever foolishness you have committed yourself to. Hawken accepted the bundle with gratitude. Thank you. For everything you have done. Do not thank me yet, Winona replied. Thank me if you survive. Otherwise I will have wasted good medicine on a stubborn fool. But there was warmth beneath her gruff words. And when she turned to leave, she paused and looked back. My husband was at Powder River, she said quietly. He was one of the warriors away hunting when the soldiers came. When he returned and found what had been done, it broke something inside him. He never spoke of it, but I knew. I saw it in his eyes every day until sickness took him 3 years ago. She met Hawken's gaze directly. Whatever you did or did not do that day, you have already paid for it many times over. This thing you are planning now, do it because it is right, not because you think it will erase the past. The past cannot be erased. It can only be learned from. Before Hawken could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness like a ghost. The next day, Samuel made his delivery to the Broken Crown mine. He returned 6 hours later with confirmation that Dutch, Tom, and Marcus were willing to help. The internal sabotage was set for 2 nights hence, giving everyone time to prepare and position themselves. Hawakan spent that time drilling his small team of 8 men on the diversionary tactics they would employ. They would not engage in direct combat if it could be avoided. Their job was to be seen, to draw attention, to make Silas's guards think the threat was coming from outside while the real action happened within. On the appointed night, Hawakan and his team moved into position on the ridge overlooking the mine compound. Below them, the operation sprawled across a full acre of cleared land. The main shaft entrance glowed with lantern light where the night shift worked to extract ore from the mountain's belly. The administration building sat slightly apart, a 2-story structure that housed Silas's office, the vault, and the payroll records. Guard towers stood at each corner of the compound, and armed men patrolled the perimeter in pairs. It was a formidable setup, designed to repel bandits or claim jumpers. But all those defenses faced outward, watching for external threats. No one was watching for danger from within. Hawakan checked his pocket watch, a battered timepiece he had carried for 20 years. 11:45. In 15 minutes, Dutch would unlock a side door to the administration building. Tom would make his rounds, ensuring the nearby guards were distracted. Marcus would create a small fire in the smelter area. Nothing dangerous, but enough to draw attention away from where it needed to be. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Hawakan's team waited in tense silence, weapons ready, but hopefully unnecessary. They were the backup plan, the distraction if something went wrong. The real heroes tonight were 3 old miners who had finally decided they would rather die standing up than live kneeling down. At precisely midnight, a small glow appeared near the smelter. Shouts rang out as workers scrambled to contain what they thought was an accidental fire. Guards moved toward the commotion, their attention focused away from the administration building. That was when everything went sideways. A single gunshot cracked through the night, sharp and unmistakable. Then another. Then a whole volley of them, coming from inside the administration building. Hawakan felt his stomach drop. Something had gone wrong, badly wrong. He ordered his team, abandoning the original plan. They could not leave their inside men to die while they sat safely on the ridge. They descended the slope at a run, rifles ready, moving toward the chaos erupting below. More gunfire echoed through the compound, and Hawakan could see muzzle flashes through the windows of the administration building. Men poured out of the bunkhouses, some armed and ready, others stumbling half-dressed into the confusion. Hawakan's team reached the outer fence and cut through it with wire snips Peter had stolen weeks ago. They slipped through and moved along the shadows between buildings, trying to reach the administration building without being spotted. But stealth was impossible now. The whole compound was on alert. A guard rounded the corner directly in front of them, his eyes going wide with surprise. Before he could raise his rifle or shout an alarm, Jacob was on him, wrestling him to the ground and knocking him unconscious with the butt of his pistol. They dragged him behind a woodpile and kept moving. The front of the administration building was a killing ground, guards positioned behind barricades and firing at something inside. Hawakan led his team around to the side, to the door Dutch was supposed to have unlocked. It stood open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. They entered carefully, weapons raised, moving through a darkened hallway toward the sound of ongoing combat. The building's interior was chaos, overturned furniture, papers scattered everywhere, and the sharp smell of gunpowder hanging thick in the air. Hawakan rounded a corner and nearly collided with Tom Begley, the night watchman. Tom's face was bloody, his left arm hanging useless at his side, but he still gripped a pistol in his right hand. "Dutch is down," Tom gasped. "Marcus, too." "We got the vault open, but Silas was inside, working late. He had guards with him. They started shooting before we could explain. "Where is Silas now?" Hawakan demanded. "Barricaded in his office on the second floor. He knows what is happening. He is going to kill everyone who helped us if we do not stop him." A fresh burst of gunfire erupted from above, and Hawakan heard a scream abruptly cut short. They were running out of time. Silas had the high ground and enough loyal men to make any assault up the stairs suicidal. But Hawakan had not survived 8 years in the wilderness by taking the expected path. He studied the building's layout, noting the exposed wooden beams, the plaster walls, the construction shortcuts taken to save money. This building was designed to look impressive, not to withstand a determined assault. "Get everyone out," Hawakan ordered his team. "Everyone who is not armed or committed to this fight. Get them clear of the building." "What are you planning?" Jacob asked, but there was understanding dawning in his eyes. "Silas wants to protect his gold," Hawakan said grimly. "Let us see how much he is willing to burn for it." Peter found 3 lanterns still intact and filled with oil. Hawakan took them and began splashing the fuel across the ground floor, soaking the wooden support beams, the furniture, anything that would burn hot and fast. The others caught on and helped, using anything flammable they could find. From above, Silas's voice rang out, full of rage and desperation. "You cannot win this. The territorial governor is in my pocket. The army commanders owe me favors. Federal troops or no federal troops, I will walk away from this and you will all hang." Hawakan finished his preparations and stood at the base of the stairs, looking up toward where Silas was hidden. "Maybe you are right," he called back. "Maybe you have bought enough corrupt men to escape justice. But tonight, right now, you have a choice. Come down peacefully, surrender to Marshal Creed when he arrives, and face trial. Or stay up there and burn with your precious gold. You are bluffing," Silas shouted. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. Hawakan struck a match. The tiny flame danced in his hand, bright and hungry. For a long moment, nothing happened. The whole building seemed to hold its breath. Then Hawakan heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and measured. Silas Cord appeared, descending. One step at a time, his hands raised but his face twisted with fury. "You have no idea what you have done," Silas hissed. "No idea who you have made an enemy of." "I know exactly who I have made an enemy of," Hawakan replied calmly. "A murderer, a thief, and a coward who hides behind hired guns, because he lacks the courage to face the consequences of his own actions." Silas lunged for Hawakan, forgetting in his rage that he was unarmed and injured. Hawakan sidestepped easily, and Jacob caught Silas from behind, pinning his arms. Outside, the sound of many horses approaching at speed cut through the night. Hawakan moved to a window and saw torches, dozens of them, riders in federal uniforms surrounding the compound. Marshal Creed rode at their head, and beside him, Margaret Flynn, alive and whole, her gray eyes scanning the chaos until they found Hawakan standing in the window. The federal troops secured the compound within the hour. They found the vault open, the gold still inside, and records that detailed every illegal transaction, every bribe, every murder Silas had ordered over the past 5 years. It was more than enough evidence to ensure he would spend the rest of his life in prison. As dawn broke over the Black Hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hawakan sat on a barrel outside the ruined administration building. His wounds ached, his body screamed for rest, but he felt lighter than he had in 8 long years. Margaret approached, moving carefully through the organized chaos of federal marshals securing evidence and taking statements. When she reached Hawakan, she simply stood there for a moment, looking at the man who had sacrificed so much for a stranger. "You kept them from finding me," she said finally. "Samuel told me what they did to you, how you refused to break. I did what needed to be done." Hawakan replied simply. "No," Margaret said firmly, the same steel in her voice he had heard in his cabin a lifetime ago. "You did more than that. You gave me my life back. You gave me the chance to see justice done for Thomas. That is not something I can ever repay." Hawakan looked at her, at this woman who had lost everything and still found the strength to ride 2 days through hostile country to reach help. "Then do not try to repay it. Just live well, live honestly. That is payment enough." Marshal Creed joined them, a tall man with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen too much but still held onto the belief that law mattered. "Mr. Blue Hawk," he said, offering his hand, "I owe you an apology. When Mrs. Flynn first told me her story, I believed her about Silas Cord, but I did not believe her when she said a native man had risked everything to help her reach me. I thought that part was embellishment, something she added to make her story more compelling. I was wrong." Hawakan shook his hand. "You listened when it mattered. That is more than most would have done. Still," Creed continued, "what you did here tonight, organizing these men, forcing Silas to surrender, that went beyond helping a stranger. That was leadership. The territory could use more men like you." But Hawakan was already shaking his head. "I am not a leader. I am just someone who finally stopped running from his past long enough to face his present." As the sun climbed higher and the last of Silas's men were loaded into wagons for transport to the territorial prison, Hawakan found himself standing at the edge of the compound, looking out at the vast expanse of the Black Hills stretching toward the horizon. 3 weeks after the siege of the Broken Crown mine, Hawakan stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching the morning mist rise from the valley below. The structure was not identical to what had been before. Samuel and a dozen other men had insisted on helping with the reconstruction, and their efforts had resulted in something sturdier, more permanent. New windows let in more light. A proper stone chimney replaced the old iron stovepipe. The roof no longer leaked when autumn rains came, but the biggest change was not in the building itself. It was in the fact that Hawakan no longer saw it as a fortress against the world, but simply as a home. His body had continued healing, though Winona warned him the damage from Garrett's torture would leave permanent reminders. His left hand sometimes trembled when he tried to do fine work. His ribs ached when the weather turned cold. Sleep still came hard on nights when memories pressed too close, yet somehow, these physical scars felt different from the invisible wounds he had carried for 8 years. They were honest injuries, earned in service of something beyond his own guilt and isolation. They told a story he was no longer ashamed to carry. A rider appeared on the trail leading up from the creek, and Hawakan recognized Margaret Flynn, even from a distance. She had visited twice since the trial ended, each time bringing news from the wider world that Hawakan found himself surprisingly interested in hearing. She dismounted near the corral where Wakagiak grazed peacefully, the mare having returned to Hawakan's care after her heroic journey to Redemption Ridge. Margaret climbed the porch steps and accepted the cup of coffee Hawakan had already poured, knowing she would arrive around this time as she always did. "You look better," she said, settling into the chair Samuel had built. "Less like a man who has been through war." "I feel better," Hawakan admitted, "though Winona says I still push myself too hard." "Winona is usually right about such things," Margaret replied with a slight smile. Then her expression grew more serious. "I came to tell you that Silas Cord was sentenced yesterday. 20 years in the territorial prison, with no possibility of early release. The judge said it would have been longer if he could have proven all the deaths Silas ordered, but the evidence for those was circumstantial. 20 years is enough," Hawakan said quietly. "A man that age will not survive to see freedom again." Rafe Kenton and 4 others received 10 years each. The rest of Silas's men took plea agreements in exchange for testimony. The whole organization is broken, scattered. It will be a generation before anyone tries to build that kind of corrupt empire in these hills again. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee and watching the wind move through the pines. Finally, Margaret spoke again, her voice carrying a weight that suggested this was the real reason for her visit. "I am leaving the territory." There is nothing for me here anymore except painful memories. My sister lives in Oregon, has a farm where she raises sheep. She wrote and said there is space for me there, a chance to start over somewhere Thomas never walked, somewhere I do not see his ghost on every street corner. Hawakan nodded understanding. Some places held too much grief to allow healing. When do you leave? End of the week. I wanted to say goodbye properly, to thank you one final time for what you did. You gave me back my life when you had every reason to turn me away and protect your own peace. Your husband would have done the same if our situations were reversed, Hawakan said. From everything you told me about Thomas Flynn, he was a good man. Good men help when help is needed. Margaret reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. I wrote down everything that happened. Not just the facts for the trial, but the whole story. How I escaped, how I found your cabin, how you risked everything for a stranger. I thought maybe someday someone should know about the man who stood up to Silas Cord when no one else would. She held out the journal, but Hawakan shook his head. Keep it. That story belongs to you as much as it does to me. Maybe more. You were the one brave enough to run, brave enough to keep going when most would have given up. I just bought you time. You did more than that, Margaret insisted, but she pulled the journal back and held it against her chest. But I will keep it. And someday, when I have children or grandchildren, I will tell them about Hawakan Blue Hawk, the man who taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. After Margaret left, Hawakan spent the afternoon working on repairs to his corral fence. The physical labor felt good, his body remembering old rhythms even as it adjusted to new limitations. He was so focused on his work that he did not hear the approach of multiple riders until they were almost upon him. He turned to find Marshal Creed dismounting, along with two other men Hawakan did not recognize. They wore the distinctive badges of federal marshals, and their bearing suggested they were not here for a social call. Mr. Blue Hawk, Creed said formally. These are Deputy Marshals Harrison and Cole from the Cheyenne office. They wanted to meet you personally. The older of the two deputies, Harrison, stepped forward and offered his hand. We have been hearing stories about what happened here, about how you organized former miners and laborers into an effective force that held Silas Cord until federal troops could arrive, about how you personally ensured his capture without any loss of life among the men following you. That is impressive work. Hawakan shook his hand warily, uncertain where this was leading. I did what needed to be done. Others did far more. Yes, we spoke with Samuel Bridger, Peter Moss, Jacob, and the others, Deputy Cole said. Every one of them credited you with the planning and leadership that made the operation successful. They also told us about your background as an Army scout, about your knowledge of the territory and the people who live here. Marshal Creed cleared his throat. What my colleagues are trying to say, perhaps less directly than necessary, is that the territorial government is establishing a new position, a liaison between the Federal Marshal Service and the native tribes in the region. Someone who understands both worlds, who can help prevent conflicts before they escalate, who can translate not just languages but intentions and customs. They want to offer you the job, Deputy Harrison said bluntly. It comes with a federal badge, a salary, and the authority to mediate disputes and enforce federal law in territories where regular marshals might not be trusted or understood. Hawakan stood very still, processing this unexpected development. A badge, authority, a return to working with the same government he had served as a scout, the government whose orders had led to the massacre at Powder River. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully, but I am not sure I am the right man for such a position. My past service to the Army ended poorly. There are reasons I chose to live alone for 8 years. We know about Powder River, Marshal Creed said quietly. We read the reports, talk to witnesses. You were a scout following orders from a colonel who should have been court-martialed for what he did that day. You were not responsible for his decisions. I led them there, Hoakan said, the old pain rising in his chest. I showed them the path. I could have refused, could have led them wrong, could have done something other than what I did. Could you? Deputy Cole asked, not unkindly. A native scout refusing a direct order from a cavalry colonel? You know what would have happened. They would have hanged you for insubordination and found the village anyway. Your death would have changed nothing except to add one more body to the count. Hoakan wanted to argue, but he found he could not. The logic was sound, even if his heart still rebelled against it. Deputy Harrison continued, the territory is changing. The wars are ending, one way or another. What comes next is either going to be a time of healing and understanding, or a time of continued bloodshed and resentment. We need people who can bridge the gap, who can stand in the middle and speak truth to both sides. You have already proven you can do that. Think about it, Marshal Creed urged. You do not have to decide today, but consider what you could accomplish. How many future tragedies you might prevent. How many young men like Peter you could guide toward better choices than the ones forced on them by desperation. After the marshals left, Hoakan sat on his porch and watched the sun descend toward the western horizon. The offer troubled him in ways he could not quite articulate. Part of him wanted nothing more than to retreat back into the solitude he had known, to rebuild the walls around his heart that recent events had torn down. But another part, the part that had felt something shift during the siege of the Broken Crown mine, recognized that isolation was no longer enough. He had spent 8 years trying to atone for one terrible day by removing himself from the world. And in the end, atonement had come not through absence, but through presence. Not through hiding, but through standing up. That evening, Winona arrived with fresh supplies and her usual gruff manner. I heard the marshals were here, she said without preamble. Samuel told me they offered you a badge. Word travels fast in these hills, Hoakan observed. It always has. So what did you tell them? I told them I would think about it. Winona set down her medicine bag and fixed him with the same stern look she had used when insisting he rest and heal. My husband spent the last years of his life consumed by what he could not change. He forgot that the living have obligations to the living, not just to the dead. Do not make his mistake. What if I fail? Hoakan asked quietly. What if I accept this position and more people die because of my choices? Then you will carry that weight along with everything else, Winona said matter-of-factly. But carrying the weight of action is easier than carrying the weight of inaction. I promise you that. After she left, Hoakan walked down to the creek where he had first found Margaret's blood trail. The place looked different now, peaceful and ordinary. It was hard to believe that such a small spot had been the beginning of everything that followed. He thought about the men who had followed him during the siege. Trust in his judgment even when the odds seemed impossible. He thought about Peter, young and guilt-ridden, finding redemption through courage. He thought about Jacob and the others who had finally stopped accepting injustice as inevitable. Most of all, he thought about Margaret riding east toward Redemption Ridge, choosing to trust that help existed if she could only reach it. She had taken that leap of faith based on nothing more than his word that Marshal Creed was honest, that justice was possible, that the world was not entirely corrupt, and she had been right to trust. The system had worked slowly and imperfectly, but it had worked. Silas Cord was in prison. His victims had received some measure of justice. The territory was marginally better than it had been. Perhaps that was all anyone could really hope to accomplish. Not perfect justice, not complete redemption, not the erasure of past wrongs. Just incremental improvement, one choice at a time, one stand at a time, one bridge built between divided peoples at a time. The next morning, Hoakan rode to Redemption Ridge and found Marshal Creed in his office, reviewing case files and drinking coffee that smelled like it had been sitting on the stove since dawn. I will take the position, Hoakan said without preamble. On 2 conditions, Creed looked up. surprise and satisfaction mixing on his weathered face. "Name them. First, I report to you directly. Not to some bureaucrat in Cheyenne who has never set foot in these hills. If I am going to do this work, I need to work with someone who understands the reality on the ground." Agreed. "What is the second condition? I choose my own assignments. If you ask me to do something I believe is unjust, I reserve the right to refuse and to argue for a better course of action. I will not be a blind instrument of policy again." "Not ever." Creed considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That is fair. In fact, that is exactly the kind of independence we need in this position. Someone who will push back against bad orders and fight for what is right, even when it is inconvenient." He pulled a badge from his desk drawer. A simple piece of metal stamped with the federal seal and the words Deputy U.S. Marshal. "Welcome to the service, Deputy Blue Hawk. May you do more good than harm. And may you find some measure of peace in the work." Hawakan accepted the badge and turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight. It was heavier than he expected, though he suspected that weight had nothing to do with the metal itself. Over the following months, Hawakan settled into his new role. He mediated disputes between settlers and native hunters over hunting grounds. He investigated claims of fraud and theft in the Indian agencies that were supposed to serve tribal interests. He tracked down outlaws who preyed on isolated homesteads, regardless of who lived there. It was hard work, often frustrating, sometimes dangerous. But it was also meaningful in ways his solitary existence had never been. He was building something, creating connections, preventing violence before it could take root and spread. One afternoon in early spring, he rode past the ruins of the Broken Crown mine. The federal government had seized the property and shut down operations pending resolution of all the legal claims against Silas's estate. The building stood empty now, slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. Hawakan dismounted and walked through the abandoned compound, his boots echoing on the dusty ground. He found himself standing in front of the administration building where he had faced down Silas Cord, with nothing but a match and the determination to see justice done. The building was still scarred by smoke damage, its windows broken, its roof partially collapsed. But wildflowers had begun growing in the spaces between the boards, and birds nested in the rafters. Nature was already beginning the slow work of reclaiming what humans had taken. "Beautiful, is it not?" a voice said from behind him. Hawakan turned to find an old native man standing nearby. His face deeply lined, but his eyes bright with intelligence and something that might have been approval. "How things that seemed so permanent can fall apart so quickly once their foundation is removed," the old man continued. Silas Cord thought his empire would last forever. But empires built on injustice always crumble eventually. The only question is how many people they crush before they fall. "Did you know him?" Hawakan asked. "Silas Cord. I knew of him." "I know of you as well. Hawakan Blue Hawk, the man who stopped running from his past and learned to walk toward his future instead." The old man smiled. "That is a hard lesson, one many never learn. But you learned it, and in doing so, you showed others that change is possible. That redemption is not about erasing what was, but about choosing what will be." Before Hawakan could respond, the old man turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of a building. When Hawakan followed, there was no one there, just the empty compound and the wind moving through abandoned structures. He stood there for a long time, thinking about the past year, about finding Margaret bleeding beside his fence, about the torture he had endured in the holding shed, about the siege and the trial and the unexpected offer that had changed everything. Most of all, he thought about the 8 years before all of that. The years spent trying to atone through isolation, through self-imposed exile from the world of human affairs. He had thought that by removing himself, by refusing to participate, he could somehow balance the scales for what had happened at Powder River. But he understood now that the scales did not balance through absence. They balanced through presence, through showing up, through making the hard choices and living with the consequences, through standing between violence and its victims, even when standing meant suffering. As he rode back toward his cabin, Hawakan felt something he had not felt in longer than he could remember. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Purpose maybe, or peace, or simply the knowledge that he was finally moving in the right direction, even if the destination remained unclear. That evening, he sat on his porch and watched the sunset over the black hills he had called home for so long. The land stretched vast and beautiful in every direction, holding stories of triumph and tragedy, of peoples displaced and cultures destroyed, of violence and injustice and cruelty beyond measure, but also stories of courage and kindness and the stubborn human refusal to surrender to darkness. Stories of women like Margaret Flynn who ran toward hope even when hope seemed impossible. Stories of young men like Peter who chose redemption over resignation. Stories of communities coming together to stand against tyranny because someone had to and no one else would. And now his own story. Not the story of the man who led soldiers to Powder River, though that would always be part of him, but the story of the man who came after, who learned through pain and isolation that atonement was not a destination but a journey, not an ending but a beginning, somewhere in the gathering darkness. An owl called out, its voice lonely but not sad. Just a creature doing what creatures do, marking territory, seeking companionship, living in the only way it knew how. Hawakan closed his eyes and let the night sounds wash over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts to mediate, new bridges to build between peoples who had every reason to hate each other and precious few reasons to trust. The work would never truly be finished, the wounds never fully healed, but that was all right. Some journeys did not have neat endings, some debts could never be fully paid, some questions had no perfect answers. What mattered was showing up anyway, doing the work anyway, choosing courage over comfort and justice over convenience. What mattered was walking forward when every instinct screamed to run, standing firm when everything around you tried to knock you down, and believing that even small acts of kindness and courage could ripple outward in ways you might never see but that mattered nonetheless. Margaret had asked him once why he would risk his life for someone he did not even know. At the time, he had spoken of debts and atonement, of guilt that could only be addressed through sacrifice. But he understood now that he had been wrong. It was not about paying debts. It was about choosing, in every moment, what kind of person you wanted to be. Whether you would look away from suffering or move toward it. Whether you would protect yourself or protect others. Whether you would let fear make you small or let courage make you whole. And in the end, that was the only answer that mattered. Not whether you succeeded or failed, not whether you were recognized or forgotten, not whether your sacrifices were appreciated or taken for granted. Just whether you had shown up when it mattered, stood up when it counted, and given whatever you had to give in service of something larger than your own pain. Hawakan Blue Hawk opened his eyes and looked out at the darkness, at the vast territory he had sworn to serve, at the endless work still waiting to be done, and he smiled. Because for the first time in 8 long years, he was finally home.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.